only thing we can be sure of about the future is that it will be absolutely fantastic. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome, everybody, to this special COVID-19 edition of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination's Into the Impossible podcast. I am your fearless host, Brian Keating, professor of physics at UC San Diego, talking with a fellow physicist, astronomer, writer, and blurber of my book. And I owe him many things, including a blurb for my book and proofreading it a long time ago, more than 3 years ago now. It's David Brin, Dr. David Brin, who is a world-renowned writer, award-winning writer, and also a scientist. And he maintains a flourishing catalog of all his musings on his website, which is called Contrary Brin, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I've wanted to talk to David on the podcast for a very long time, but a particular article of his in Contrary Brin, which you can find at davidbrin.blogspot.com, was really focused on sort of the tagline, the subheading, which is looking towards the future. And David, first of all, let me welcome you and ask, how are you doing, and where are you? I'm down by the beach. Where are you currently?
Well, I happen to know you are obeying the law better than that.
That's right.
If you were at La Jolla Shores at this moment, but I'm in my office at home. For me, that adjustment is not as great as for most people. Most days I am working right here, either writing fiction or nonfiction or that sort of thing. Still waiting to hear from NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts program as to whether or not there's going to be a orientation meeting, because I'm on their team of advisors, the advisory council for NIAC, whether there's going to be a meeting back east in DC in June, and I expect it'll be canceled. But I'm hoping we'll get past all of this in time for NIAC's symposium in October, because it's a highlight of my year to participate in NASA's most innovative and most far out and almost science fictional program. And giving grants to small seed grants to groups that think they have something a bit outside the envelope that's worth investing.
Interesting. I heard seed funding or phase 1 study was approved for a radio telescope on the far side of the moon today. I don't know if that was under your purview or not.
Yes. Well, NIAC just announced its new grants, and there are a number of things. Joel Sersel of Transastra, for example, has grants to investigate mining of asteroids for water, and another has an innovative way to get solar power down into the deep craters at the lunar poles where the ice is. And the ice is there because the sunlight never falls there. So it's a little hard to combine copious solar power with this refining the water from a place where it exists there because there's never solar power.
Right, exactly. It's like the solar-powered flashlight I once received as a swag gift from the SPIE. It kind of confused me at first.
Oh, I used to collect the hand-powered flashlights, but the solar-powered flashlight, that's a funny one, yes.
So David, today we wanted to get your opinion on this, obviously this whole Brave New World sort of cliche that we seem to be inhabiting. And I spoke last week with your friend, Michael Shermer, on the Into the Impossible podcast that should be out by the time people hear this. And we discussed kind of the role that science fiction and science fiction authors play in really visualizing the future and helping us. And, some are more successful in your case than others. I won't name the others, but what is it about science fiction that can be used? Is it its ability to sort of run as Einstein called it, Gedanken experiments, thought experiments. What about science fiction enables people to be futurists? Because on the face of it, they're not necessarily related, right?
Yes, well, the whole question of prediction is a fraught and a difficult one. Professor Tetlock, for example, has been leading efforts that I've been engaged in because I'm one of those science fiction authors who speaks at the CIA and other agencies annually because they really want to get one more way of parting the curtain. But as Tetlock points out, even when you develop a new way to part the curtain on the future and model better, for example, all that does is move the goalpost a little. We're all used now to these wonderful, fantastic weather models, for example, where you can get a vague general idea what the weather is going to be like in your region 10 days out. And that for the next 48 hours, it's really useful hour by hour.
Yes.
When I was a kid, you were lucky if the 2-hour weather report was even vaguely in the right direction. So this is a fantastic sign of the competence and advancement of the models of the people who are using the same technologies and the same formulas as the climate people studying global climate change. So it really puts a burden of proof on people who deny climate change that the models that they use to plan their vacations or what to wear that day suddenly are no darn good when applied to similar problems. But what happens and what Tetlock points out is that when you move the goalposts, you only make the problem harder. And especially if everybody gets models, like models of the economy or models of the stock market, then everybody starts using them, and that makes the models no good anymore.
Right.
So what science fiction does is we have a tendency to claim we're not in this business to predict. We're the highest form of science fiction is novels or movies that prevent. In other words, we're not trying to predict what's going to happen. We're sometimes trying to prevent things from happening. And it can, at its best, be very effective. Millions of environmentalists were recruited to be active in this world in environmental causes by the movie Soylent Green. Mm-hmm. And by a number of science fiction stories by John Brunner and Kate Wilhelm and others, showing how if we're careless, we could lose it all. Nuclear war. Retired military officers say that it was definitely prevented. Accidents were prevented by movies like Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, On the Beach, stuff like that changed the mindset, War Games, that changed the mindset just enough so that some potential failure modes were fixed. The granddaddy of all self-preventing prophecies would be George Orwell's 1984, which to this day inspires millions to worry about undue accumulation of power by conspiring elites. The difference between a decent Democrat and a decent Republican, and this used to be the case back when both were lively species, is that the decent Democrat is afraid that Orwellian powers are being accumulated by would-be big brothers out of aristocracy and wealth and faceless corporations. And a decent Republican is afraid that Big Brother is coalescing among snooty academics and faceless government bureaucrats. But if you put it that way, they're both right. Right. Both are dangerous, and we should be guarding each other's backs. And the one thing that's been a collapse this last decade or so has been this sense that we're guarding each other's backs. Instead, we've been pitted against each other. So, as Isaac Asimov said, no, it was Fred Pohl. It's not the science fiction author's job to predict the automobile. It's our job to predict the traffic jam. What are the possible repercussions of these advances? And so, I've done predictions in the near future, the intermediate future, which is really hard in my novels, Earth and Existence. And then there's the far future, where you can have lots of fun. You throw in warp drive and talking dolphins and have some great adventures. But it's the nearer term stuff where you can have real effect.
Exactly. So we're in the middle of a potentially existential climate of in the biological sphere, and sort of ecological, mixed with the impact of humans and animals, and that is of course, the COVID-19 worldwide pandemic. And what I thought would be so timely is to kind of go through your thought process on how you appraise these risks. You are an advisor, as you said, to certain three-letter agencies, and that's for a reason. And I think that some of the scenarios you paint sort of long-term and perhaps intermediate term, and then certainly longer-term impacts. And I think what I want to know, first of all, have you ever lived through anything comparable to this? I mean, the closest that I can think of is September 11th, when there's just a paradigm shift. Does this remind you of anything? I mean, you're not old enough. I tease you and I love you, but I never would even hint that you're old enough to remember the Depression, because of course you're not. But from your parents, from your father, who's a renowned scholar himself, what did he tell you? What lessons from the past? Is this comparable in any way, or are we just on a totally different branch of the wave function right now?
Well, you for one thing, Brian, you very smartly pointed in the right direction, and the right direction is the past. Science fiction authors, supposedly, science is the main thing driving our extrapolations and our projections, but that's not true. It should have been named speculative history, because a certain fraction of science fiction, mine, because I have the training, is often, not always, based upon the next scientific thing. But almost all science fiction authors are deeply steeped in history, because that's what science fiction really does. It is taking the greatest story ever told, and that is the 6,000 years of recorded human history, which is horrendous, a story of horrendous errors and injustices and grotesque mistakes made by kings who killed the people who might have helped them to prevent that mistake, because it was criticism. And you know how humans love criticism. Especially human leaders. If you look across all that time and you see the patterns, you realize that that's the story. Breaking out from those patterns, from those traps. And so, it's not for accident that my father's generation was called the greatest generation. They survived the Depression when things were worse than this. They overcame Hitler when the threat was worse than what we face. He was born into the 1918 flu epidemic. They all lived in deadly fear for their children up until I was about 6 years old, when Jonas Salk saved childhood by immunizing us against polio. And whereas Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the most beloved figure for the greatest generation, absolutely adored by them, Jonas Salk was adored by the generations of the 50s for giving us back hope in our childhood and easing the fears of all those people who were far more desperately afraid for their children.
Yeah.
Than we are now. For the old guys like me, who might be the top victims of the COVID virus. So, it's the historical perspective, I think, that we're sadly lacking. And especially, in the political problems we have. I mean, to not recognize that across those 6,000 years, almost 99% of all those cultures languished under feudalism, ruled by kings and priests and lords and all of that. When the last 200 years, when we escaped from that way of life, we started actually accomplishing stuff. Duh! So to go back to rule by some aristocracy or king, this is the agenda that Vladimir Putin and the Saudis have for us. It's not just that it's not our way. It's a stupid way, and there's 6,000 years of proof that it's a stupid way.
Yeah. And so looking towards the future without being particularly Pollyannish, I would say you really list a couple of different things that resonated especially with me, and that is that in your article, again, we're going to post this in the show notes, both in YouTube and on the iTunes store for podcasts. This is an article called More Repercussions in a Plague Year and Some Long Term. The first thing I thought was so interesting for you to sort of cite was what may be happening behind perhaps one of the most intriguing characters in society today, someone by the name of Elon Musk. And that's how, sort of these brilliant visionaries can perhaps take maybe their own initiative, advisedly or not, but try thousands of seeds planted in the ground to see if perhaps one will bloom. So I think I want to focus on the first of your kind of major predictions, or perhaps it's already occurring right now, and that is how we could actually bifurcate the problem at its root, and perhaps go and find some resistance, or perhaps find people via serology or other means of testing to look for this, people that have recovered from this. So first, can you talk about this idea that you write could have occurred elsewhere, or could have occurred to someone like Elon Musk, for people that may or may not have had this illness currently and be asymptomatic at present?
Well, I mean, it seemed obvious to me about a month ago. I started talking about this and got really bad feedback from people. And all of a sudden now, about 1 week ago, I start seeing the idea everywhere. And that's the job of a science fiction author, to get apoplectic and upset because nobody gives you credit for the idea that they all called ridiculous just recently.
That's right. The ridicule phase is the prerequisite for the adopted as obvious.
Yeah, it's a standard professional complaint. In this case, it's very simple. If we had good testing, and we don't yet, it's been promised for some time, but if we had good testing, it would be possible for Elon Musk, for example, to put out a call for auto workers who have already experienced their COVID-19 infection. Now, maybe they got sick and recovered. Maybe they just simply tested out, as about a third of people do, as having had it, gained an immunity, and never noticed.
Yep.
You put them in quarantine at the Pebble Beach Golf Club, which is not very far from the Elon's Tesla factory.
Right? It's empty currently.
For 1 week, and keep testing them. And then you ship them over to the Tesla factory and say, everyone working in this factory is COVID positive. So who are they going to hurt? Now, it's true. There are listed, they found about 6 different subvariants of the COVID-19. And it is possible to get secondarily infected with a different variant. So things are more complicated. But from what I've heard, those secondary, for healthy, young or middle-aged people who have already experienced the virus, those secondary infections manifest as a sniffle. So the question is, how long will it be? I predict before the end of the week, before somebody comes out and says, why don't we have some restaurants that are staffed by COVID positives and are open for COVID positives? How about that Universal Studios is for COVID positives and Disneyland for COVID negatives? You can't do the latter. You can't do it for the latter until you have really, really good rapid testing. But at least it's a path to getting things back open again. And I'll be honest with you, I see it as really the only path in the near future. Now, you go a little farther and you go a little farther into the future and you start having other things. I mean, the testing opens up other possibilities. But of course, like for instance, doing it intelligently, doing isolation intelligently, the way the South Koreans and the Taiwanese did. And that's actually testing everybody and then finding the supercarriers and doing contact tracing. Now that's standard quarantine techniques, and we'll be better at that next time. Yes. It's been pointed out that the death rate for COVID-19 is terrible, but largely because the sick people will overwhelm our medical staff. The death rate is not truly horrendous by historical standards. And so some people say, well, this is going to leave us in much better shape for when something really science fictional hits, something really horrible hits. And I have science fiction about that. There's been a lot of science fiction about pandemics. Mm-hmm. Well, you can go to my website. I have a page of pandemic stories and novels and movies. People are talking about how one of the soonest treatments that they may try out of desperation is what's called serum. Now, you've all heard that word. And a lot of women have skincare serums, they're called. They're sold in these little tiny bottles, and it has nothing to do with what a real serum is. A real serum is where you take blood from a person who has survived an illness and strain out the antibodies and give them to a victim just to knock the virus down so that the victim has time to develop their own antibodies. And so that's being tried in a very preliminary way around the world. So
that's you point out in the piece has been featured in Omega Man and Outbreak, two films that you describe as lurid.
Yes, because in those films, in Outbreak, they come back with the monkey that's the original source, and right. Cuba Gooding Jr. disappears into a trailer. A lab trailer, and comes out within 45 minutes with the serum. With the serum that it almost instantly saves Rene Russo. It's a little harder than that. But that's the point.
Yeah.
It's going to get easier because we're going to throw resources at this.
Fascinating, yeah. And I think, you start off in terms of technological changes with a call out to the Manhattan Project, and you discussed a little bit in the context of the greatest generation. So two of my, kind of green shoots looking forward is that perhaps as the Manhattan Project did for physics in the 20th century, namely stimulating nuclear research, high energy particle physics, the LHC, particle physics in general, both theory and these massive colliders, culminating with the Large Hadron Collider in Europe, as well as the program to develop radar, which, as you know, led to the development of radio astronomy as a practical tool to learn more about the universe, including the serendipitous discovery by Bell Laboratory scientists Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson of the cosmic microwave background radiation that I study. Those were both directly related with genetics and direct lineage to the World War II. So the Manhattan Project, of course, is much more well known for producing the atom bomb, but equally important and arguably much more important on a daily basis for things like weather radar, et cetera, was the development of radar taking place at Lincoln Labs and Bell eventually as well. So I like to think maybe a green shoot that might emerge will be found in the context of rapid testing, which is not high tech, but scalability of advanced technology. But perhaps with a real Manhattan Project-esque push to develop CRISPR, to develop biological testing and editing and capabilities for the first time, reminiscent of the Manhattan Project. My question to you is, can we keep up with nature? In other words, we harness the power of the atom, before we were really mature enough to use it properly, arguably, although it did lead to the end of World War II, obviously. But do you think a similar danger could be present in this green shoot that we might develop technology that might come back to haunt us later on?
Well, I think those are several very, very good questions, very good points. And all of my life, I've heard the phrase, it's too bad that our wisdom hasn't kept up with our technology. And my blog is called Contrary Brin, which means that I have an automatic reflex that got me killed in all of my previous lives before I was 16 years old. And I have an automatic, by the way, I don't believe in reincarnation. That is a metaphor. The reflex to be contrarian is that, in fact, it appears to me that there have been many technologies that have not met the schedules we expected for them, like spaceflight. We expected to be at Saturn by now. Mm-hmm. But our ancestors, even in the greatest generation, if we brought them forward from World War II, to have seen President Obama, for example, to have seen the mixed races that are routine on television and we take for granted now, to have seen so many things, examples of us gradually, grudgingly becoming better. Now, it's true that right now, the forces that are preventing us from showing the maturity towards ecological matters, that easily 60%, even 70% of Americans would prefer to see, that there are reasons why that generously forward-looking attitude is not propelling us as far as it should. But this is one of the reasons why I wrote my nonfiction book called The Transparent Society. And that is that one thing has enabled us to accomplish so much in a positive sum way. The positive sum is where I win. I want to win more than you win. But I don't want to win by causing you to lose.
Right.
In a positive sum game, all I want to be is a little richer than you. I want you to be rich too. A zero-sum game is one in which I win by making you lose. And that's what happens in most sports. And that was most of human history.
Right.
If we can manage a positive sum game, then the rising tide raises all boats. And the only thing that has ever enabled that to happen is what we innovated for the last 200 years, and that's transparency. Reciprocally being able to find each other's errors and hold each other accountable, then make alliances with each other. So, that's a whole other topic.
Yeah.
As far as the implications for this plague year is concerned, what we need to do is take advantage of the vast proliferation of talent and skill that we've been developing. And the only way we can do that is by keeping things open.
Yeah.
I look back at 9/11. People look back at the year 2001 and they remember the Twin Towers falling. What they don't remember is something that happened a month later, and that was the anthrax attacks. This brilliant imbecile filled envelopes with weaponized anthrax spores and sent them around to sabotage and murder, and a couple people died. And what was the response of the United States government? The United States immediately said, hello, all the world's experts. Here's what's going on. Come and help.
Right.
And as a result, the 99.99% of skilled biological researchers who were sane collaborated to overcome the 0.0001% who were insane.
Yes.
And the problem was solved quickly. And that's what we rely upon.
Exactly. And I think, you brought up in that, concomitant with the transparent society, I think has to be an openness and obviously the sunlight being the best disinfectant. And in the book, or in the piece rather, which maybe you'll turn into a book, you talk a lot about the really, kind of tectonic shifts in the way that Americans have adapted more or less instantaneously. I know I'm running, this unlicensed daycare center here while advising graduate students and trying not to, toilet train a graduate student or teach quantum mechanics to a 2-year-old. And that's a meeting with mixed success, but I'm getting through it. You point out the role of kind of remote virtual presence. And I wonder if you could get into that a little bit. How can society expect to take advantage of this, or do you think as soon as the all clear is given, we will get back to our old habits and continue, flying around the world to go to climate change conferences or astronomical telescopes, etc. Do you see a long-term repercussion accruing to our benefit, or do you think we're natural to go back to our wasteful old ways?
Well, I think it's going to be sort of midway between those two. Mm-hmm. Obviously, for instance, there are several technologies that are going to get a huge boost out of this, beyond the biomedical, beyond the important ones that we're going to be investing in to handle the testing and the vaccines much quicker than before, and the detection and all of that. For one thing, is going to be local sourcing. The ships that crisscross the ocean, spewing carbon into the air, and just because labor was a little bit cheaper in China, that's going to go into decline because it was already going to go into a decline. Because we're gaining technologies that will enable people in a city to get a large fraction of their food, a large fraction of their manufactured goods from real close nearby. That includes additive manufacturing, 3D printing, all sorts of things. And that's going to reduce waste. And so it's going to have positive ecological benefits, but it's also going to make us more resilient. And that's a very important word. The last several times I've been back east to talk to 3-letter agencies, I've pounded the table about resilience. And there's there's an interview that I did with the Proceedings of the ACM that will appear underneath this interview, and Brian will, I'm sure, offer that link, in which I talk about all sorts of ways in which our cell phones, for example, in a crisis, is the exact time when we need them and the exact time they won't work.
Yes.
Because the cell towers will go down. And we've seen this happen many times. There is a way that our phone systems could be vastly more resilient. And it would be very easy if it's ready to do it. It's almost turnkey. We have 2 million solar homes in America today. Almost all of them shut down in a power blackout for a really, really stupid reason that could be easily fixed. And I speak about pandemics and things like that. This was in an interview last year. So this notion of resilience is something that's absolutely essential for us to restore. And one of the things will be local sourcing. Another is, yes, we'll develop better business meetingware, better speechifying ways of holding meetings and things like that. And the regular meetings, conventions and all that, they'll be back. But this is a personal worry to me because a substantial portion of my income has come from public speaking.
Yeah.
Will I be paid the big bucks for a speech to a virtual audience?
You might have to rely on the proceeds, the honorarium that I'm sending you after today.
Oh, yes. I expect to cash that in.
That's right. Another thing that you brought up, and I know that you take part in personally, is sort of this, really ultra local, micro local economy of gardening and subsistence. Can you talk about the prospects for that in a world where there could be, say, a second wave, a third wave? Would you say now is not a bad time for people to do as you have done with urban or maybe suburban farming for people that can do such a thing? I find it a great way not only to have some resiliency measure. I don't have a huge plot, but to have some resiliency and also educate my kids. What do you think about that as a positive outcome of this whole awful pandemic?
Well, for one thing, having developed a fairly large vegetable garden, I have come to realize that there's no way on God's green earth I'm going to feed myself or my family.
It's too hard.
It's just a complete illusion. What I am going to do is I'm going to get a whole lot of artichokes that I can swap.
Yes.
I can barter. Maybe I can barter for a bushel of grain at some point. But
I'll give you a telescope eyepiece that I'm not using in exchange for a bushel.
There you go. No, but to have the habit of maintaining a victory garden, this is one of the positives, the green shoots you talk about. It's almost impossible to buy seeds right at this particular point in April 2020 because people are loading up their minivans with manure and seeds and going for it. Now, I think that's terrific.
Yeah.
At the opposite extreme of that impulse is, of course, the preppers, and they're buying up guns as if they didn't already have 40 or 50 guns. My novel, The Postman, which was made into that movie by Kevin Costner, and I have mixed feelings about it. It was actually visually and musically.
I love that movie. I know you pan it, but I actually really enjoy it.
I think 2 out of 3 ain't bad. It's visually and musically one of the most beautiful films ever shot.
It's my favorite Kevin Costner movie. Don't destroy it.
And he did not betray the heart message about citizenship in my book. It's dumber than a stone, but gorgeous, big-hearted, and dumb. That's what my wife married. There's worse things. There's worse things than gorgeous, big-hearted, and dumb.
And do you see? You talk also about education, which is obviously a priority for you. Not only having been the product of the higher educational system, earning your doctorate, attending Caltech, attending UC San Diego, and being a practicing astronomer for some time before you went commercial. No, before you began your really illustrious career as a writer and thinker and public intellectual, which I think is really the way I think about you. What do you see as the future of education? Even before this happened, I started to think about distance learning? Is my career, is my job really a long-term for my students and their students, my grand students, of which I have a couple already, which is kind of scary. My graduate students who are professors themselves have now obtained their own graduate students. I think when you get to the fourth generation, you have to quit or something. But when I look at them, I look at my young graduates, grandchildren, as it were, in graduate school. What prospects will they have when, perhaps in not too long from now, instead of talking to me about astronomy, they can talk to a doppelganger of Galileo himself? What relevance will I have in such an era?
Well, look, I'm torn about that sort of question. First off, the science fiction author in me is happy to dive in and write stories about such scenarios. And I have. One of my most popular stories called Stones of Significance is set in a pretty much post-singularity world in which we're pretty much gods. People are pretty much gods because we've added to those prefrontal lobes you mentioned new layers. They're in the walls of the house, and they're interacting with us, and we aren't being dominated by AI. We are AI.
Augmented. That's right.
And so it's great grist for science fiction. And I might mention my short story, The Giving Plague, which is about how viruses interact with their hosts and find either a way to kill them or come to terms with their hosts. Mm-hmm. And it's available at my website, davidbrin.com. You just go to short stories and you can get this Hugo-nominated story, The Giving Plague. And it's has somewhat to do with the fact that I was then and am now a blood donor, and I was just prevented by the COVID thing from giving my 96th pint. But there's also another side of me. And that is the consultant. That's the the guy who gives sage speeches about the near future, and that guy says one thing, and that is, it's not our job to worry about that, about whether or not the grand graduate students, the little tiny, the distant graduate students of your graduate students talk to an AI Galileo, or whether or not they have to use sign language because they're chimps, or they squeak through a translator because they're dolphins, or they're aliens, or they're AIs. Our job is to create a civilization that's wise enough to raise them to be wise enough to deal with that. That's enough.
Intellectual to have the children.
That's enough. It's enough. Dainu, it's enough for us to raise a new generation that's not stupid in the ways we were. Just like we're not stupid in the ways our parents took for granted. My parents were liberals of their day. Mm-hmm. But they would have plotzed if I brought home a date from a distant race. They would have got used to it. They were like that. But they weren't used to it. So it's our job to make things better enough that our wiser and better children can make children who are wiser and better enough that they can make the makers of Star Trek.
Very good, very good. So in the last couple of minutes before we break for this inaugural episode of what I think or and hope will be a recurring series, but we'll see depending on whether the check actually clears that I've posted in the mail. But the postman is late today, so no pun intended.
The postman.
The postman, exactly. You got it. Yes. So I want to just kind of close with some thoughts, perhaps recollections that you can share with us of how people can develop this resiliency of mind. And I think that's really what you're getting at with what we owe our graduate students. Well, it's not just to graduate students alone. It should be for the public, for the intellectually engaged public who pay our taxes as scientists, especially those of us in state universities like myself. And I want to know, in the end, we started off with a little bit of history. Maybe we can end with a little bit of history of how people can get engaged, or perhaps, is there something to be hopeful about that we haven't covered? Perhaps, I see the globalism and things like that. Perhaps that's something that we now can rely on in a positive way. Maybe cooperating with countries around the world, instead of kind of fighting with one another. Because we don't have a foe, that can really be vanquished the way that we did in a war. And so, I think it's hard to maintain this level of discipline, of commitment. And do you see any danger of society kind of having trouble adjusting to this as a reality? Or do you think that we could pull together, as generations of the past have, through intellectual curiosity, engagement, as we like to study here at the Arthur C. Clarke Center? Do you feel hopeful? I mean, what's your, in a sentence, what are you feeling right now, just at an emotional level, for the future?
Well, I'm contrary, Brin. So
Yes,
if I'm around optimists who are fizzing with just total, blithe assumptions of success, I can shake my finger with the best of them. There are plenty of warning signs. I live in an era in which there's too much gloom, and it is reducing our confidence, which is the basis upon which we can solve problems and save all our lives. I think the odds have always been against us, especially against this renaissance that escaped from the stupidity trap of feudalism. The odds have always been against us, and I think the odds are still against us. But with the odds only being 2-1 against us, that makes me a freaking optimist in the course of human events. And I think we can do it. Our parents' generation did it. Right. Are we made of lesser stuff? No, I refuse that. It insults them to say that they made a generation less good than them. And I'll tell you this, my kids' generation, I talk to them. I talk to a great many of them, and they are better, nicer, smarter people than us okay boomers.
Yeah.
And who gets the credit for that?
Yes, that's right. He has two thumbs.
Them.
That's right.
So they can't win, even if they're better than us, and that's they are. We made them. That's exactly the pattern that has to continue. And what we need to do, us boomers, is stop panicking, decide that we are in favor of this renaissance, quell phase 8 of the freaking American Civil War, and the phases go back to 1778. It wasn't just the 1860s. Quell this phase of the American Civil War, get it behind us, and start doing what we're good at. And that is surprising everybody.
Very good. Well, that certainly brightened up my day on a otherwise gloomy, cloudy, rainy San Diego early spring day. David, I want to thank you for this. I want to potentially schedule a revisit of this sometime in the not too distant future. And I want to thank you for your time, your insights, as usual. I want to point out to folks that David can be found all over the web, but in particular, the article that we were quoting today comes from his blog spot, davidbrin.blogspot.com. He also maintains a website at davidbrin.com, and I think you can get interchangeably between the two. I'll provide some links and resources in the show notes. And I want to thank folks out there for listening, and please leave your comments in the comment section if you're watching this on YouTube. Please leave a review if you're listening on iTunes. And really appreciate your time, David. Stay well, stay healthy. We need you more than ever.
Well, I have pretty low blood pressure, so I'm not too worried. But I am scrubbing every surface. So you guys take care, and thank you, Brian Keating, a maven of mavens and scholar of scholars.
Thank you, David.
The only thing we can be sure of about the future is that it will be absolutely fantastic. 5, 4, 3, 2,